She woke up baby LeBon, soothing the little one as best she could. The 3-year-old was cranky and bewildered at being awakened in the middle of the night, and she began to cry as Sally got her into underpants, a blouse, and a romper. The sound of the child's crying made her more afraid than ever. She associated it with the other times baby LeBon, usually the most angelic of babies, had cried in the night. Diaper rash, teething, croup, colic. Fear slowly changed to anger as she saw Charlie almost run past the door with a double handful of her own underwear. Brass straps trailed out behind him like streamers from a New Year's Eve noisemakers. He flung them into one of the suitcases and slammed it shut. The hem of her best slip hung up, and she just bet it was torn. Welcome everyone to another installment of my Stephen King analysis series, the third part of my King's Algorithm series because, well, after the roller coaster ride that was Gerald's Game, and as I just started rereading Dolores Clairborne, I decided last minute to close 2022 with a bang, and that meant coming back to the algorithm analysis. I'm AdalisaZ, and today we are continuing our hike through Stephen King's longest book, as we met the third archetype, who ironically is usually one of the first characters we meet. The sacrifice. That, in the stand, is baby LeBon, her father Charles D, and her mother Sally, the Campions. Well, them and a bunch of unnamed scientists that were the first ones to meet Captain Trips. But I will explain why I choose the family and not the scientist as we start our journey today. So far, we have talked about the most important characters in the formula, the artist and the child. They are important because they are usually the main characters, and their presence on the story gives us an idea if the ending will be positive or negative, and sometimes if the evil will be vanquished or not. However, they are not the only important characters we have to analyze because there are other factors that affect the story, and sometimes those characters have a huge impact in it even if their scenes are very, very short. The sacrifice is one of those characters. See, before the real evil can enter the plot, a sacrifice is needed. A first death, a first loss. And thus, the sooner the evil appears, the less time the sacrifice has to shine. There are very few exceptions to this, one of these being Needful Things, where the actual death of the sacrifice is almost at the end of the novel, and it's not even the first death in the book. But there are reasons for this, given that the evil in Needful Things is a very special kind of evil. Even so, the death of the sacrifice, in that novel, rings the beginning of the real destruction of Castle Rock. So there is that. This is one of the archetypes that appear early on in King's work. Obviously, the first one where we can see this is Carrie, where we have one death that might be confused as a sacrifice, as it's described in a ritualistic manner, and another one, almost casually mentioned just in passing, which is the real sacrifice, as it's the one that opens the door to the massacre and the loss of Carrie's sanity. The first death is, of course, the pigs that Chris and Billy killed to get the blood needed for the deadly prank. Pig's blood for a pig, Chris says, and it's the classical animal sacrifice that we can see in other horror stories, even in King's own work. But that is not the sacrifice that brings in the massacre. That is just one of the ingredients needed for the real horror. The real sacrifice is Tommy Ross, whose death is what really makes it impossible for the story to end in a somewhat happy note, and not just because Tommy is a proto-artist, because at that moment we lost the only current artist in the story, but because of everyone in that room? Because out of everyone in that room, the only one who could have talked Carrie down from her anger, make her see that people were not laughing at her despite of what she believed, was Tommy. He's even starting to yell in her defense before the bucket hits him, either knocking him unconscious or killing him immediately, and with that, any hope for Carrie to calm down is gone. His death opens the flood of violence that makes Carrie famous. This happens again in Salem's Lot. We first have a ritual animal sacrifice, a dog who had the bad luck of having 2 black spots over his eyes on his otherwise completely white fur, and then a human sacrifice, Ralphie Gillick. Ralphie's death is so horrible that the same narration of the book tells us that what happened to him is impossible to describe, And we are talking about the book where we later see a man being impaled with swords as he falls on them and get it all described with every gory detail. Not only that, the fate of said man was going to be even more gruesome, and King had no problem describing that. So whatever happened to Ralphie Glick must have been the stuff of nightmares. It is in Salem's Lot where King specifically says that there is a ticket of admission for able to arrive, rites to be performed to allow the true power of those who follow the Crimson, as the evil is called in King's books, to be used in any situation. And here is when it becomes a bit hard to give characteristics to the sacrifice, since at first glance it's just the first important death. However, they do have some extra things needed, and one of them is that they must be innocent. And that even in the occasion that they don't die immediately at the beginning of the novel, when their death is drawn out as much as possible, as in the case of poor Brian Rusk, their death is impossible to stop. There's a few novels where the sacrifice occurs before the events of the novel, and then we have them in flashbacks, like is the case, arguably, of The Shining, although we will talk about that later, or the Tommyknockers. But the bigger the sacrifice, the bigger the evil that will come. Now, imagine how big the evil is when the sacrifice begins with an innocent family of 3, the Campions, and ends with the death of 99% of the world. As I said, we don't get to know a lot of some sacrifices given the nature of the role. This happens with the Campions, as we only get to meet them if we are reading The Stand complete and uncut, as this includes the small prologue where a panicked Campion arrives to his home, tells his wife to pack everything she can fast, and fly out of the military compound where he lives. Before they notice, he's gone. If, on the other hand, we are reading the original edition of The Stand, well, then we only get to see Charles' last minutes alive as he crashes into Bill Pumps at his gas station when he's delirious and asking if his wife Sally and baby LaBonne, who, by Stu Redman's estimation, have been dead at least for a day or two, are okay. So yeah, we barely get to know them at all. Still, their impact in the story is gigantic. Charles was a guard at the entrance of Project Blue, the lab where Captain Trips was created. And thanks to him booting it out of his position the second the alarms had signaled how the lab was going to be completely closed as the virus escaped containment, and killed everyone inside the same lab immediately, in many cases before anyone knew what was going on, as some just fell into whatever they were doing, the virus managed to get out and possibly mutate in order to still be lethal, but wait until it could be passed on to a new host inside of him and his family. He knows he wasn't fast enough though, as symptoms appear quite early on them all. "I felt pretty good until last night," he said. "Coughing, but all right. Woke up with it in the night. Didn't get away quick enough." This is both tragic, and then he asked about his baby daughter, who we already know is dead, and got a horrible description of what the virus did to her and her mother. But it's also selfish. Because no matter if we understand his fear, his reasons to run away from the lab the moment the clock went from green to red and he realized that all the scientists and lay workers were dead, his desire to survive doomed everyone. We don't know about any people they may or may not have infected from Nevada to Texas, the 4 states they crossed in their escape, but he sure passes the virus to the 4 men who tried to help him at Hamscop gas station, as well as the ambulance crew who tried to save his life. They all, with the exception of Stu, who happens to be one of the 1% of the population who is completely immune to Captain Trips, then pass it to every single person they come in contact with, and so begins the most deadly chain letter in the history of mankind. However, as I pointed out, this is not the only sacrifice that we have in the book. They are the first sacrifice, which opens up the road for the first evil, the pandemic. And I have to say, the description about how Captain Trips got all over the world so fast, the lack of response from the government, even from those who didn't know about Project Blue, and how people shrugged it at first as just the flu. It's harder to read in hindsight after both H1N1 and of course COVID. Between the descriptions of the sick people in the first part of The Stand and the contagion scene in the movie theater in Outbreak, I think that is why I plan on keep wearing a mask outside my house for the foreseeable future, thank you very much. Anyway, that is how we get to the second sacrifice, and the entrance of a far more dangerous and powerful evil. The second sacrifice is, of course, 99% of mankind. Well, perhaps a bit less, as we still have some people surviving and dying after the introduction of the second evil. But it is quite telling that we don't get the introduction of our main villain until after the creators of Project Blue admit to themselves that they pretty much brought in the end of the world and that there is no cure to be found. Chapter 22 is that chapter, as we finally get to see what Charles Campions saw that scared him so much that made him leave his post, trying to get as far away from everyone as he could. The inside of Project Blue, with all the dead scientists, including one whose face is half submerged into his soup. Campbell's letter soup. A deadly postcard of the last seconds of life in a busy laboratory that got completely destroyed by one tiny mistake that is never explained. We never know how the virus escaped, and in the end, it doesn't really matter, does it? The important thing is that it did, and that once it got out, there was no way to stop it. And then we have chapter 23, and the introduction of one of King's most famous villains that we have seen before in another book, the evil and cunning Randall Flagg. The thing about the sacrifice is that while we don't get to know them for a long time, we do get to know them and feel bad for them. The eerie description of the Project Blue hallways, wonderfully replicated in the opening of the original The Stand miniseries back in 1994, is good enough to make us feel bad for all the scientists who, yes, were making horrible bioweapons that turned against them, but still didn't deserve to spend eternity in the locked lab, dead just because someone didn't close a tube fast enough. By the way, this is where I beg you all to watch the 1994 mini if you can. While it was pretty 90s, but in budget and acting, it has some incredibly well done scenes, and the opening, set to Don't Fear the Reaper, is one of those. The thing is, they are not just the only sacrifice, as I said. Nor are just Campions, but, as I keep harping on, everyone in the world. And The Stand is the only novel where King has the time to go wild on how many sacrifices we get to meet, both before and after Flagg makes his appearance. There is a doomed town of Arnett, which was already dying by the time that Campion crashed at Hampscon gas station. King takes a lot of captors to tell us about the inhabitants as they are taken over by the army. We get to know them by Stu's memories as he's locked up in a lab where scientists try to figure out why he's immune, and he finds out at the end of those locked chapters that he's the only survivor. Then there is Chapter 8, which describes precisely how the virus went from cop Joe Bob Brentwood to an incredible number of people, starting with Harry Trent of Maine, an insurance seller who even tried to sell Joe a policy while being ticketed for speeding on the highway, and from Harry to more than 40 people. And that's the thing. I can't tell you all the names of the people who got infected on those first days, as King didn't let us know. But I can tell you enough. Like the Norris family who had been to Disney World in Orlando where the kids had been in seventh heaven, not knowing that the whole family would be dead by the 2nd of July. They passed the illness to many people, including Sarah Bradford, who passed it to her whole bridge club, and many, many more people in their way there and back. What makes The Stand so powerful is that at the same time that it gives us an incredible amount of dead people, so many that they become a statistic, King also gives us enough of their names, makes them real enough with just a few paragraphs, so they are not just a number to us. There were people whose stories got cut short in the most unfair of ways, especially because they had no way of knowing what was going on at first, and by the time someone gave the alarm to the public, it was too little, too late. Now, in the previous 2 archetype videos, I pointed out that there is possible to have a novel without an artist, even if that is going to end up really, really, really bad, or a novel where the child is metaphorical or in the past, the inner child of the main character, so to speak. However, there is no novel where there is not a sacrifice that happens within the narrative. The closest we get are The Shining and Misery, but those are particular cases because, you see, the evil never gets freed in The Shining, and Misery is not really a Stephen King novel. Yes, I know. Jack Torrance gets possessed and tries to kill Danny. That is pretty evil no matter how you slice it. However, the actual evil with capital letters, that is the hotel, never gets to be completely free. It is dependent on Danny's powers and Jack's willingness to be possessed, and it clearly needs Danny to be killed in order to absorb him and then really get free. The previous sacrifice of the Kratis family was enough to keep it going, but not to give it the real power that it desired. That is why I say that The Shining is a special case. No active sacrifice within the novel, no big evil getting free and leaving the place. In short, The Shining is a novel about the sacrifice that doesn't happen. Misery, on the other hand, has a metaphorical sacrifice, the destruction of Paul's not Misery novel, but at the same time, it doesn't follow all of King's rules because it began as a Richard Bachman novel, with all that it implies. And yes, I will have to talk about Richard Bachman and his particular style later. In fact, I think we can tell exactly the moment where Richard got up from the chair and let Stephen finish the novel, because the tone of the story changes into a more hopeful one at that point. And even then, we still have all the people that Danny killed before getting her hands on Paul, which would count as a pre-novel sacrifice. Again, this is very common in King's stories. There was a sacrifice in the past that may have opened the door a bit, but we still need a new one within the novel to really let the evil in. The sacrifice is at the same time one of the most common archetypes in King's work and one of the least recognized. This is because at the end of the day, well, one more death among the many that we get in his books can go unnoticed. But it's still an important one, as the scope of the sacrifice, from one character to many, from a quick death to a long drawn-out one, well, they will affect how powerful the evil on the novel is. Now, it's important to know that just because you have a big sacrifice, it doesn't mean that the evil is unbeatable, nor that a small one means that the evil will be easy to face. The Mist, the original tale, not the adaptation with the terrible ending, and yes, we will talk about why that ending is terrible soonish, is a good example of it. Our official sacrifice is the woman who lives, alone, to try and save her children. She is the one whose disappearance lets Miss Carmody start showing paranoia about our survivors. And make no mistake, in The Mist, Miss Carmody is even more evil than all the monsters outside in the dark. And while she may be unimportant, the unnamed woman, the evil she releases is unrelenting. On the other hand, yes, Flag is a lot of trouble in the stand, but he can be beaten. It just requires a bigger sacrifice to get there. I want to thank my dear patrons Mitch Hyman, Elaine Ho, and Jessic, as well as my first supporter Tanya Pineda and Amy Sung, who is the best person in the universe and without whom these videos would not exist. I also want to remind you that if you want to support this and my other projects and get your name mentioned here, you can do so at patreon.com/Adalisa, written link on description, as I know my name can be hard to spell. And with just $1 a month, you will always be thanked in my videos, as well as get access to a ton of art before anyone else. Or, if you prefer a one-off offer, at Coffee, with just one donation of $3, you will get a mention in the next video I make. If you can't support me this way, I also accept likes, subscriptions to the channels, and of course, you sharing the links. I also welcome all your questions, feedbacks, and suggestions in the comment box below. And well, while my next video will surely be Dolores Clairborne, remember, when we return to the stand, we will talk about the role of the authority figure in Stephen King's novels.